podcast is brought to you by Schema Business School.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the seminar on globalization. Coming next, we discuss the polarized debate regarding market forces and globalization. What we have done already is discussing the pro-market globalization, as you remember, with Smith, Ricardo, and so on. Well, today we discuss the anti-market globalization. In fact, the pro-global market camp is a mainstream camp. In fact, they provided, since the 1960s, a formidable intellectual framework to justify financial and economic and trade deregulation. They focus on the self-regulating role of market. They focus on the rationality of economic agents. And they also focus on market efficiency, and they stress the need to minimize state intervention. The other camp, well, questions this market efficiency assumption. The free market forces, for this camp, for Keynes, for Marx, and so on, not only will provide imbalances and financial crises and volatility, but even in times of growth, it will also provide social imbalances with unequal income and wealth distribution. Hence, on the one side, basically market forces should not be controlled nor regulated. On the other side, Marx, Keynes, Polanyi, Krugman, Hinsky, and Stiglitz consider the need for some form of regulation and state intervention. At the heart of the debate between those who basically consider market forces work and those who consider that market forces should be regulated by the state is a question of this need to regulate. The so-called neoclassical monetarist economists conclude that the lesser the state intervention, the better. And why? Because any state intervention, sooner or later, will contribute to market distortions, hence unemployment and inflation. Yes, maybe nominal wages will increase, but in fact real wages will decrease. And monetary policy cannot do much. In fact, it is too important to be left in the hands of politicians. Central banks should be left independent. The Keynesian economists consider that it is crucial to smooth economic cycles, to decrease volatility, to decrease the level and duration of crises, and in case of depression, as we know today in the global economy, the state's role should be to provide stimulus in order to expand demand, even at the cost of a temporary budget deficit and at the cost of higher debt, public debt. The role of the multiplier of public spending is crucial, as the state can spend, can hire people, these people will consume, will spend, and this will lead to larger employment, larger investment, and economic growth. So temporary budget deficit should be accepted. In fact, they are crucial to prevent a depression of economic activities. Regarding the global framework, the first camp, those who basically favor market globalization, think that it's a win-win. The openness to global markets leads to socio-economic development. And those who are skeptical consider that, it's a distorted growth process. It's a formidable engine of economic growth, but not at all an engine of income and wealth distribution. In fact, it increases the gap of wealth within and between countries. The conflicting diagnosis, on the global economy, in case of crisis, will lead, of course, to conflicting management strategy. And of course, the toolkit will be totally different, to tackle economic imbalances. This anti-liberal school of thought starts with Marx and what I call his grandsons. It's so-called dependency school, 1960s, 1970s. And then, closer to us, we have Polanyi in the 1940s, and today, Krugman, Sachs, and Stiglitz. Well, everything starts with the Industrial Revolution, the rising capitalist market economy, 1850s. And from his British Library's SIT, Karl Marx concludes that history is a process of class struggles between the owners of capital and the workers. Using the Hegelian dialectics, Karl Marx concludes that world capitalism is doomed to systemic crisis and also doomed to become globalized. An inevitable consequence of capital accumulation and market competition is gradually, number one, to lead to monopolies, less and less competition, and number two, to invest outside the developed capitalist countries into developing countries where basically labor is cheaper and inputs are also cheaper. Marx, writing Das Kapital, will conclude that any society will go through several stages: feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and ultimately capitalism will lead to communism. There is an engine of historical development through several contradictions in capitalism. The first one is between labor exploitation and the need to stimulate consumption, and this will lead to overproduction crisis. Why? Because the capitalist owners of production will try to squeeze labor wages in order to boost profits, but in the meantime, they need to sell the output of their production. Hence, they need to get purchasing power in the hands of workers. As purchasing power will be squeezed, there will be an overproduction crisis. Number two, market competition to increase market share will lead, in fact, to invest outside the capitalist economies in order to extract profits from developing countries, exploiting developing countries' labor force, hence postponing the diminishing trend in profits. And last but not least, well, market competition will lead to capital concentration. In the modern world, mergers and acquisitions, and this will erode, will shrink competition. Hence, large monopolies, the winner takes all. So the toolkit of Marx theory is that the combination between capital accumulation and labor exploitation will generate surplus value and profits, but in the meantime, there is a long-term trend towards diminishing profits. Hence, the capitalist system is doomed to get globalized. And Marx, as early as the 1850s, 19th century, in fact, was the first probably to theorize, to develop a theory of globalization. This falling rate in profits can be described simply by a ratio. The profit rate is a ratio between profits and labor, PL and W, whereas we have in the denominator the increase in capital versus wages, as capitalists must compete by increasing their capital investment. There is a limit to exploit wages, to exploit workers, So this PL to W ratio tends to shrink, whereas the denominator tends to increase. Hence, all in all, the ratio is diminishing, and this will lead, again, the capitalist world economy to become worldwide, globalized. 1 century later, in the 1860s and 70s, this intellectual framework provided by Marx will become modernized by the so-called dependency school, mainly in the US, Latin America, and somewhat in Europe. Well, it says that the world economy is split, is structured into two parts. Number one, the core countries and the periphery developing countries, where labor is cheaper, raw materials prices are also lower, and where developed countries can get access to higher profits, hence trade and financial transactions. Who are they? Well, Wallerstein, Paul Baran, Sweezy, Samir Amin, Palois, and Gunther Frank, well known for his book, The Capitalist World Economy. How does it work? Well, these core countries, namely the OECD or the G7, the US, Canada, Japan, and the EU and Britain, can borrow in their own currencies. They can issue bonds. Whereas, in fact, developing countries in the periphery depend on capital markets under the control of the core countries. And we have here, between the core countries and the periphery, transactions in trade, finance, which basically transfer profits from the periphery to the core. These capitalist world economy emerge in the Renaissance in the 16th century and gradually expanded all over the world in a modern capitalist form since the Industrial Revolution in the mid-19th century. The engine of growth is profit maximization. What is new is that not only, it is the labor cost which is minimized, the workers are exploited in one specific country, but in the world economy, developing countries are exploited by the core, rich, developed capitalist countries. And this is today under the supremacy of the US economy, while it was under the domination, the control of Britain and the pound in the 19th century. So this capitalist process is not a smooth process of evolution. On the contrary, it's also contaminated by its internal contradictions, and it's an engine of crisis. There's no regulation, and basically it will lead to a number of systemic crises and, according to the dependency school, to a socialist state. In French, le grand soir. Karl Polanyi, in the mid-1940s, with his book, The Great Transformation, gives us an interesting historical approach to the emergence of markets. What does he say? Well, he says that basically markets are not eternal nor spontaneous. They did not emerge overnight, They are a byproduct of a strong state intervention. Nation-states in Europe and the US in the 19th century provided the necessary framework for market development. Until the 19th century, markets were embedded, were included in social systems under the control of cities, municipalities, a church maybe, during the Middle Age. And suddenly, markets get independent, de facto subordinating the social system. And this has led, not only to a fantastic rise in productivity and so-called economic progress, but also to social and cultural dislocation. Polanyi, focuses on the social impact of market developments. Chang also, provides us with an interesting approach to the history of capitalist development. What does he say? Well, like Polanyi, in fact, markets are not spontaneous. Markets are supported, by governments, by state action. And it looks at the emergence of capitalism in Britain in the 18th century and in the US in the late 18th and early 19th century. What it says is that, in fact, in both Japan, US, and Britain, economic development was based on strong protectionist barriers. The only way, in fact, for the Western Europe, the US, and Japan to develop their economic system and their markets has been to close these markets to foreign competition in order to protect their infant industry. And Chang says that, in fact, it is unfair today to impose trade openness on emerging market countries, whereas you cannot explain the rise of modern capitalism in the OECD without trade protectionist barriers. So, in fact, he concludes that emerging market countries should use temporarily trade protectionist devices. We now get to the so-called off-mainstream camp, which I call the dissidents, with Krugman, Stiglitz, and others. Well, these dissidents, in fact, are neo-Keynesians. And why? Because for shorthand, they don't buy the assumptions of Chicago economics, regarding market rationality and self-regulation. Chicago economics says that, markets don't get things wrong. Governments do. Hence, no state intervention. Well, the dissidents, the neo-Keynesians, think that, number one, you cannot predict the future. You cannot price risk accurately. Almost impossible. Hence, markets crash. Number two, falling back on conventions, people think that the future replicates the past. Hence, they use, a probability distribution along the so-called bell curve, normal distribution, which means no fat tails, as Mandelbrot says. They also think that there is no self-correction of markets. Hence, there is a risk of protracted crisis, as we know today. In this case, they also think that governments should intervene to provide and inject extra spending, even at the cost of temporary budget deficits. And this will, help providing demand stimulus, hence decreasing the severity and the length of crisis. Not only in times, of crisis, but in times of economic growth, markets should be regulated in order to provide an extra dimension, social dimension, in the form of better income and wealth distribution. And finally, financial intermediation should be regulated to provide long-term financing for the real economy and to sustain employment. So all in all, they think, as I explained in my book published by Pearson, that we have a twofold emancipation, one of the economic system from the political system, 1960s, trade liberalization, privatization, and so on, And number two, later in the 1980s and 90s, emancipation of the financial system from the economic system, what I have called hyper finance or free will finance. Basically, the financial system cut loose from its economic base, hence dwarfing it. As you remember, financial assets today are 4 times as much as underlying GDP. So we have two schools, those who favor financial globalization. Why? Because they say, like Greenspan, Fisher, and Summers, that openness to global capital flows will help developing countries get access to capital in order to boost investment, and this will lead to a technology spillover and larger GDP for all, win-win. Well, Stiglitz, Sachs, Krugman, and Roderick and others, think that, no, this is too dangerous. Capital liberalization will lead to capital flows volatility, short-term capital flows. It will lead to speculation. It will lead to financial crises, hence the need to embark on regulations imposing capital controls and, why not, the so-called Tobin tax. Krugman has an interesting point here, he looks at the trade theory framework provided by Ricardo and Eshurlin. As you remember, Ricardo emphasizes that trade, is based on comparative advantage between countries of similar economic and production characteristics in terms of labor, capital, agriculture, industry, But in fact, looking today in the 21st century, a larger and larger share of trade takes place between countries of similar characteristics, relatively developed countries. And trade is still welfare enhancing if countries use scale economies. They can increase production, hence reducing cost and prices. And Krugman, at an interesting point on the global trade system, he observed that on the one side, consumers prefer a wide range of products. But in the meantime, production favors economies of scale, less wider range of choice. So in each country, consumers will push for diverse choice of goods, but there is a trade-off between diversity and cost, of course. Consumers want diversity, but since there are economies of scale, a unit will cost less of production as it gets larger and larger. More diversity means higher prices. So the only way to solve this dilemma is to embark on trade. Economics of scales in production and diversity of choice in consumption will lead each country to specialize in producing a few brands of any given type of product instead of specializing in different types of products. And this choice of comparative advantage and economies of scale is, I think, at the heart of the challenge of competitiveness in Europe, in particular between Germany and France. Germany has made a choice, strategic choice, to specialize in a few high-quality products. Krugman focuses on the so-called dark sides of globalization. He says that, global integration creates volatility. And it creates, the conditions for crisis, for protracted crisis, and for contamination, the so-called spillover effect, And this stems from deregulation and privatization. Regarding the impact of globalization on wages, Krugman observed that, in fact, developing countries compete with low wages and unqualified jobs in the OECD countries, and this tends to push wages down, not only in the US, but also in Europe. Competition from Asia, from Latin America, in particular between China and the US, Mexico and the US. But for Krugman, the key is not protectionism, back to the 1930s, the Great Depression. In fact, the key is to implement labor standards and higher wages in fast-growing emerging market countries. He says that the duty of the developed countries is to keep their trade open to the competition of developing countries, hence providing higher purchasing power in these countries, hence larger export potential for the OECD countries. Krugman criticizes strongly the role of the IMF in the 1997 Asian crisis and today. Krugman considers that the IMF uses a short-sighted approach to the crisis. Why? Because the IMF, in fact, in the 1990s, not only in Mexico but in Asia, imposed the same therapy of austerity on each and every country in Asia, hence transforming the national economic crisis into a regional and international crisis. And Krugman puts a lot of emphasis on the role of governance. And why? Well, because he thinks that a good deal of crisis has to do with what he calls crony capitalism. It means corruption, speculation, low investment efficiency, and cozy links between the banking system and the industrial system. And he thinks that not only, the conditions for economic takeoff are savings and investment, but also strong regulation and good governance. There is also the viewpoint of Jeff Sachs, working with the UN's General Secretary. Also, he shoots at the IMF in the 1998 crisis. He thinks that the IMF, in fact, imposed macroeconomic austerity on Asian countries at a time when they needed, on the contrary, extra demand stimulus with probably temporary budget deficit and large injection of capital from the IMF, but also from FDI, foreign direct investment. This analysis, of the short-sighted policy of the IMF back in the late 1990s, I think is also extremely useful to understand today that austerity kills growth. Krugman, Jeff Sachs, of course, look at what the IMF said on the eve of the 1998 crisis. A few weeks before the Thai baht devaluation, the IMF, welcomed the impressive economic performance in Thailand, in Malaysia, in South Korea, without looking at the root causes of the upcoming crisis. There is also a point tackled by Stiglitz. Stiglitz, main ideas can be summarized as the fact that capitalist economy basically is based on a wrong intellectual framework and a number of assumptions which are not true, what he called Chicago economics. There is no perfect information, there is no perfect competition. Markets look at the number of crises, markets are not efficient, and there is no self-regulation. In fact, Stiglitz, summarizes his point by saying, simply said, the invisible hand of Smith does not work. He also thinks that in a world of global market economy, poverty is an affront to dignity. The capitalist economy, yes, generates economic growth, but for a few. And the wealth gap gets larger and larger within and between countries. Globalization works well as an engine of production, but not as an engine of income distribution. And the IMF's policy are based on, basically a few hypotheses which are not close to the actual working of markets. Markets, in fact, create volatility, they create crises. A good deal of Stiglitz's point is based on his attack on the symmetry of information hypothesis. In fact, a good deal of this market efficiency rationale is based on the assumption that information is shared equally between economic agents, between the borrower and the lender, between the worker and his employer. And in fact, for Stiglitz, there is an asymmetry of information, which means that in fact the information is not shared equally And does it lead to market rationality? Does it lead to self-regulation? In fact, it leads to crisis and volatility. This mismatch between national regulation and market globalization has led to weak governance, not only at the level of the state, but also at the level of multilateral institutions. The IMF, the World Bank, are strongly criticized by Stiglitz, although he worked many, many years in Washington in the World Bank. Stiglitz also criticized the framework of policy action under the so-called Washington Consensus of 1990, which imposes basically the same framework of market-based economic policies on each and every government. He thinks that at different point in time, countries need to develop a specific economic policy toolkit, adaptable to the social and cultural and political situations in each country. And the IMF is wrong, to impose the same framework. He also thinks that the IMF has its own problem with governance. A good deal of the IMF's governance is basically based on the 1945 national system. Only a few countries, the G7, are in the driving seat. And today, the share of emerging countries like Brazil, Russia, Malaysia, China, and India in the IMF are still minimal. Thomas Friedman has also, an interesting point looking at the impact of globalization on cultural and social development. In fact, he thinks that a lot of the imbalances and tensions today stem from a tension between market globalization and traditional forces of culture and social organization. Is against the imposition, like Stiglitz, of these golden straitjackets of the Washington Consensus. Everyone should deregulate, everyone should liberalize, everyone should privatize. And this leads to accelerated market economic development, whereas the social system still lags behind. So there is, in fact, a shock between economic and social development. And all this leads to volatility, social conflicts, crises, and regional and global recessions. This volatility issue has been tackled by Hyman Minsky in the 1980s, 1990s, and he says that there is basically a cycle moving, from stability to irrational exuberance, to speculation, to excess risk-taking, and to crisis. In fact, these cycles, if they are to be broken, should be under the control, of regulators and central banks. During ongoing economic stability, people, households, companies, governments are encouraged to take more debt, basically. And lenders are encouraged, to provide more loans with higher risk-taking and higher leverage and lower capitalization. That should be prudent. All this leads to financial innovation and debt accumulation. And gradually, you get back, in fact, to liquidity and sooner or later, solvency crisis. These cycles go through three main steps. Number one, so-called hedge finance, where debt is still a small side of liabilities. A good deal, comes from equity. Then speculative finance, when the future revenues, the future cash flows, are not large enough to sustain debt payments. The company or the country has to borrow increasingly just, in fact, to match past principal debt payments. And the worst is the next stage, the so-called Ponzi finance, where countries, households, companies have to borrow increasing amounts of debt, not only to pay back the debt, but also to service interest payments. This critical approach to market globalization cannot finish before saying a few words regarding the so-called French school. This, in fact, would require an entire seminar discussing the contribution of Fernand Braudel, Raymond Aron, Michel Foucault, Pierre Bourdieu, my old friend, former colleague, Charles-Albert Michelet, and also someone I know well, Bernard Stiegler of Ars Industrialiste. It will be too long, but let me just say a few words regarding their contribution. Number one, they think that the world capitalist system emerged, a long time before the Industrial Revolution. Braudel, for example, observes the roots of capitalism as early as during the Renaissance. It is not a spontaneous process. This emergence of the capitalist world economy is based on strong state intervention. They criticize the market rationality. The market is not rational. The market is not self-regulating. Economic agents are not rational. They also think there is a tension between the liberal school, which favors a minimum state intervention, and the Marxist Keynesian school, which in fact wants to get control of a centralized institution like the state. Well, in between, they consider that there is a space for mobilization of popular forces, of new social mediations, non-state actors, NGOs, and, for example, associations, which can, in fact, mobilize popular support, to develop, a democratic process against the globalized economic process. And finally, they also consider that capitalism, yes, has become global, but also cultural. The overwhelming power of global finance imposes a short-term horizon, whereas social and economic and cultural issues and challenges require a long-term horizon. Last but not least, let me conclude with Benoît Mandelbrot, whom we know well at Schema. Mandelbrot provided a major contribution to the intellectual challenge of the rationality of the market hypothesis. Mandelbrot concludes, after years of scrutiny of market forces, that markets are not rational, they are not self-regulating. We live, in a globalized economic system where the winner takes all, an extreme concentration of capital and profits. He thinks that, the distribution of probability of crisis is not distributed along a bell-shaped curve. That's a myth. The Gauss law does not work. Normal distribution does not work. You have a number of crises which accelerate, and their impact gets larger and larger. Volatility, in fact, comes by big jumps. Why? Because the globalized economy has become an echo chamber, where a good deal, of the crisis stem from contamination, contagion, and spillover effect. Something will happen in California with the real estate bubble, and it will trigger a chain reaction, a domino effect, not only in the US economic and financial systems, but it will cross the Atlantic, hitting Europe, and it will also impact on developing economies. All in all, in the 70s and 80s, Mandelbrot contributed, to this analysis of sharp market volatility with a new intellectual contribution called fractal geometry, which today might provide a new analytical tool to predict and maybe to manage crises. Who knows? Thank you very much.